Well, we always like to start, Adam, with tweets of the week, and we're going to kind of theme these in two different approaches. The first one is we're going to talk about some recruiting, and in addition to the analytics that you guys work with coaches and football ops people, you also get into recruiting analytics. And so this was what I would say is a fun tweet that we sent out about a week ago, and it's that the Lincoln Airport currently has direct flights to Chicago, Denver, and Houston. And then from a purely recruiting standpoint, if you could name your top three nonstop destinations you would like to see L&K add, where would they be? So we have Lincoln, Denver, and Houston right now, but where would we like to add from that? And we'll go around the room, but I'll start with you, Adam, and we'll go from there.
Wow. Okay. So with this staff so far, it seems like you'd want something in, like, let's say Newark, New Jersey, out east that way, which, think about a non-stop flight to Newark, that wouldn't be a destination most people outside of recruiting. But, I think with the staff, they've proven they have a lot of those East Coast ties, so that might be good for them. I know, we have Houston up there, but I think just a nonstop flight to Dallas would be useful, and then one to Atlanta. I think you get those three on there, and you have a lot of good bases covered there.
Mm-hmm. Grand Island flies to Dallas. It's a little surprising that we don't have that from Lincoln. How about you, Dave?
Yeah, well, I would say, at least in the short term, I would like it to fly to Phoenix in particular, unless we can just have a charter flight for one particular individual on a regular basis, or maybe an assistant coach and a family member. I don't know, but Phoenix seems handy right now.
Yeah. Boomer.
Well, I just kind of go along with Dave here. Something to the West Coast, whether it's Phoenix or LA, especially with UCLA and USC coming into the conference. I think you're going to have better recruiting opportunities out west, and you might as well take advantage of that. As long should be a coast to coast operation when it comes to recruiting to Nebraska, so that'd give you the chance.
Yeah, it was, Coach White, the new defensive coordinator, has connections out west, and I know we just brought in a defensive lineman from California. I think the three that I wrote down, I kind of took the approach a little bit that Adam did of something out east to reflect Coach Rhule's background, whether that's Philadelphia or, you can name 100 towns out there, but Philly, Newark, something that would be in that area. I think I did Dallas as well, which doubles up in Texas, but that seems to be such a priority area that it kind of made sense. And then to your point there, Boomer, I did throw something out west, and I don't know if it was Vegas or LA or something, but just something to get us kind of into that side.
Fresno, something like that.
Yeah. Fresno, it's lovely this time of year. And I know that we had some people responding that are like, the coaches don't fly commercial, they get on a private plane, which again defeats the purpose of the question. And also this is for players being able to fly in here too on a Saturday morning, and that's always been a challenge to get kids into Lincoln, in a quick manner on recruiting weekends during the season. And so if you think of it that way, it is nice to have some direct flights that can come in. We used to have Atlanta when we had Delta, but that went away. All right. Well, speaking of recruiting, March 25th is a big one here. I'm not going to go through all the names, but headlining it, Dylan Raiola, a couple of 5-star guys, a couple 4-star guys, a big weekend that's starting to get in the works here. I doubt that it's just going to end with these 9 that are listed. I think this is more to get us into a larger conversation about recruiting. And, Adam, I'm going to bring you back into this now. We've had this discussion a lot on the show. I don't want to get philosophical about what does a star mean, but how important are stars, or how important is recruiting classes, having a top 10 one to have a top 10 team, top 15, or where do you definitely need to be in at the minimum to get to the place where I think all of us as fans want to be?
Well, yeah, well, recruiting is very important. You look at just straight up picking winners in college football, right? I think it's 77%. Now, my partner Dave Bartu has this written down somewhere. He tracks this a little closer than I do, but 77% of all winners, you can pick just from talent alone. Just who has the more talented roster. So that right there tells you, hey, yeah, the recruiting rankings, they are not perfect. There's different ways to go about it, but they do mean something. As far as getting where Nebraska wants to go, the college football playoff, there's been only since it now before TCU got in this year, that was kind of a different story, and before Cincinnati lost a couple of years. Any team that has been like a threat in the college football playoff was in the top 10 as far as roster talent over the course of 4 years. So if you're wanting to compete at a high level, you've got to get your composite roster talent rating down into that top 10. I mean, you're not going to go in and beat Georgia or beat Ohio State or beat Alabama with the 25th, 30th, ranked roster talent in the country. That's most likely not going to happen, and it's least likely to happen now that the playoff is expanded, because you're going to have to win 3 games in a row against some of those more talented teams. So recruiting matters a lot. I know people could try to downplay it and say, oh, we're going to go find diamonds in the rough, and that's great to find a few of those, but you can't base your entire roster on diamonds in the rough.
So a couple questions, Adam. First, could I get an email from you for football season, so when we start gambling, I can actually get some advice? And secondly, so like how when you're talking about evaluating talent on rosters and recruiting numbers, how does Matrix Analytical do that compared to, say, a Rivals or an On3? I mean, like, what are you doing? Are you doing composite of some sort? Are you doing something different? I just want to understand the logistics of how you're scoring and ranking these teams and the rosters.
It's just purely composite rankings from On3 and from Rivals and from 247 over the past 4 years. And then we now that the transfer portal is what it is, every year you have to go in and track where kids have gone, which is a task in itself. But every year, more than the past, for sure, those roster talent is ebb and flow. So but that's how we do it, and we try to keep up with the transfer portal the best we can. But yeah, it's just purely composite recruiting rankings. We don't do anything special.
Yeah. And are you using it's a little bit in the weeds, but I've noticed some of the recruiting services now like re-rank players in the transfer portal opposed to just using their incoming freshman score. Is that what you're doing too? Or using that
exactly.
Score? Yeah. Good. It's really interesting to see how sometimes they get re-ranked. It's really intriguing.
It is.
Yeah.
Do you find is there a big difference between Rivals and 24/7 and ESPN, whatever the different ones that you use? Do you notice a big difference between them, or is there? I guess I'll just leave it at that. Are they pretty comparable? I guess in most cases.
Most cases they're pretty comparable. Like within the top, say 30 or 35 teams are pretty comparable. When you get down below that, that's when you start seeing your big inconsistencies, just because of how those different sites rate their classes and how they come up with those ratings with how many are in each of those recruiting classes for some of those lower ranked teams. So the top 35 or top 40 are usually pretty consistent. You get down past that, and it kind of starts to get a little wild after that. But that's why
it's fair to say that like ESPN seems to be kind of like disassociating themselves a little bit from the recruiting rankings. They don't seem to be that much focused on that any longer.
We don't use ESPN at all. Yeah. We use so
makes sense.
There was a couple articles this weekend in the World Herald Journal Star, and it was about how Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, the talent has risen, or at least we're getting more scholarship offers. And I think some of this leads to the questions of, is the talent better, or is the talent good? And people are getting noticed now through things. We've had Glenn Snodgrass, the coach at York, on, and we talked to him about this last summer, and he talked about how important Huddle was, and services like Huddle, where a kid can be living out in Ainsworth, like Carter Nelson is, a 4-star tight end, and being out in Ainsworth, he can send out, he's an 8-man football player, and he can send out his video on Huddle and have coaches all over the place see it. We talked with Steve Warren last year, and again, Warren Academy, and what services like the Warren Academy are doing, giving players these opportunities to go to camps and get seen and just help them with the recruiting process. All of that combined with good talent, and all of a sudden we've got a lot of schools coming into to Nebraska to get our players.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, when I grew up in rural Nebraska, right? And back then there were kids I knew who were just, they were country strong, just big, strong guys. They weren't much in the weight room, but they threw bales all summer long. And this dudes you didn't want to play football against. You hated lining up against those guys because you knew it was going to be like hitting a piece of iron. Those type of guys who just they never got exposed like they should have. And now, like you said, with Huddle and with some of these other, coaches are like, for example, Coach Rhule, he's got certain metrics he looks for. Okay. He looks for speed. He looks for a certain size of an offensive lineman he's looking for. If a kid hits those metrics, then he takes a closer look at him. Right. And he can teach the game of football to that kid. He looks for those certain attributes. Coaches with that type of mindset are going to find more of those players because they're not locked into necessarily what the kid is ranked on those recruiting sites. They're going to go out and they're going to find these kids, and you'll see that a lot of these times after a coach like Coach Rhule finds these kids and covers them, then the rankings come afterwards. So I mean, it's interesting.
Quick question here, Adam, and I know this is not what actually you do. You just said you use a composite score from other recruiting services, but since you do speak with coaches and work with various different athletic departments, are you aware of schools that or coaches that have like their own recruiting ranking system, essentially? That, I mean, obviously they have the big board and they're doing their own self-evaluations of players, especially early in a process, but are they using metrics just like how you support for making coaching searches and all those type of things? Are they using metrics that same way kind of that the recruiting services, but have their own like weighting system and all that type of stuff? Do you know?
Well, we've actually done some work for some schools in the past where they've asked us, hey, what is the average height and weight of a kid coming out of high school who starts in the game in our conference? Okay.
Right.
And so we'll put that together for a coach or an athletic department, and they will actually go out and use those metrics in recruiting. They'll look for an offensive lineman who's between 6'3" and 6'6" and 260 and 290. They'll look for kids in that size range, and that helps them filter it down and focus on those guys so there's not so much film to watch. That's come across more than once, and we've done that for more than one program. So that's is that kind of what you're asking? Is that what you're kind of
yeah, exactly. I mean, I would just try to think through, like, again, you're not the one doing this, but I imagine you would have seen or heard coaches that are using metrics in their own way, right?
Exactly.
Opposed to just relying on, because the Honkies point, we've always had a hard time defining how a Rivals or a 247 or an on-3 gets to their score. Right. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of a black box because it's their like proprietary system. Right. And we've always tried to make the case of like, well, really good coaching staffs probably should be making their own evaluation. If you're just looking at the on-3 board and saying, oh, I'm going to go after those 20 linebackers because on-3 tells me they're good, that's probably not a very good way to recruit to your class. You want to figure out how you want to recruit. I was just wondering how much that they are doing that on a real metrics based standpoint.
Yeah, I think it's creeping into the game more and more, what you're saying. Coaches are becoming more and more aware of, hey, we might find that diamond in the rough outside of that size range, but let's play the 80-20 rule here. And if we miss out on that 20%, fine, but we're going to hit 80% of the time on the guys we're looking for. Yeah. Especially with how extensive the recruiting season is now. Coaches don't have time to go through and filter through 1,800 offensive linemen. It's much more efficient for them to filter that down to 500, and then really focus on those guys and get the guys out of there that fit their scheme and fit their vision for what they're trying to do in each program.
I think you definitely see staffs growing at Nebraska. I know we have the tied with Michigan now with the largest staff that's been hired. I think sometimes with the recruiting, for me, it's one of the things that frustrates me a little bit is it's the chicken or the egg thing. Someone's a 4-star. Is it because some, Rivals or whoever it is? I'm not picking on one, but they identified this as a great player, or I can recall a 2-star kid that came to one of the coaches' clinics that I was at. He was being recruited by, it was Mike Riley at the time. And this 2-star quarterback steps in front of the team after practice, and and he just gets introduced to the team. And then also I noticed Alabama, I think the next day offered him, and suddenly he was a 4-star. And it was like, it was that kind of it's that game of like, I'm sure the kid.
Well, he was a quick learner, Honky.
Yeah, he wasn't magically, all the more talented or anything. He just went from 2 to 4 stars overnight, and you see things like that. But in the state of Nebraska, this is an interesting year. This last one, we had 8 kids that have come to Nebraska, that's an amazing number to start with. But you live down in Oklahoma, Adam, and 2 of the kids we didn't get. One of them is McIntyre from Fremont Bergen going to Oklahoma, and then the quarterback of the year, the one that we didn't offer until Rhule got here, is going out there to Oklahoma State. And there's 2 more kids that went to Iowa State. So that's 12 kids going P5 from the state of Nebraska. And I don't see that going away now that the other schools are willing to come here and make relationships and see that there's talent.
I mean, the talents, I mean, let's be real. The talent's always been there in a metro. It's just been underappreciated and undervalued. I think it's a gold mine that people are just starting to realize. And, I think when we heard Coach Rhule and that staff say that, hey, we need to lock this down, those are things that you'd like to hear. I mean, you want to hear a staff take pride and be a little territorial about their home state. And that'll be interesting going forward to see if we can capitalize a little bit on those relationships he's creating and keep some of those kids in the state.
Mm-hmm. I say we because Adam, if people aren't aware of this, and you've been on the show last year with us too, Adam's a Husker fan in addition to the role that he has obviously with the Matrix Analytical. So it's interesting because I know that this is a special program to you, and